subject of the Goldstone Report has been a matter of controversy for a considerable period of time, and the many leading voices in the international press, for example, have raised serious doubts about the flaws in the work that was done by the Goldstone mission. The Economist called the report deeply flawed. Others, like the London Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, spoke about its biases and the problems that the report raised. There have been important military figures who have raised doubts about the report, from the British, Australian, and Italian armies, all of whom are familiar with the complexities of counterinsurgency warfare today. Today we're focusing on something else that really hasn't been examined up until now with respect to the report. And that is the level of professionalism of its military analysis. The focus today will be on the fourth member of the Goldstone mission, Colonel Desmond Travers, from the Irish Defence Forces, who was the main military figure on the Goldstone mission. As you remember, the Goldstone mission was headed by Justice Richard Goldstone. There was Judge Gilani from Pakistan. There was Professor Chinkin from the UK. And the fourth member was Desmond Travers. Travers' explanations, as we will see today, are extremely problematic. And we'll speak about four dimensions in which his presentation is extremely flawed, and we question its basic professionalism. First of all, I would like to start with the fact that his work, which we have studied both in the testimonies during the period in which the UN collected testimonies in the Gaza Strip, and in various interviews that he gave, most recently on February 2nd of this year, reveal a fundamental bias against the Israel Defense Forces, against Tzahal. I think the best way to see it is to look at the actual collection of testimonies he and the other members of the UN mission obtained in the Gaza Strip during July of 2009. All those testimonies, and there's several hours of them, are on the websites of the United Nations. And therefore we have downloaded one specific clip, which just gives you a taste of Colonel Travers' own prejudices. We have to clip.
I would like to put a question to you. It may not be entirely within your field, but nevertheless the question continuously comes around in my mind. We have heard testimony of great violence, seemingly militarily unnecessary violence inflicted particularly on children. There have been instances of the shooting of children in front of their parents. As an ex-soldier, I find that kind of action to be very, very strange and very unique. I would like to ask you if you have any professional insights as to what mindset or what conditioning or what training will bring around a state of behavior that will cause a soldier, a fellow human being, to shoot children in front of their parents. Do you have any professional insights into that kind of behavior?
Now, Travers is asking this question to two Palestinian psychologists of the Gaza Strip. Many of the other witnesses are just regular Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip who have no particular training in these specialized fields. But it seemed to us extremely odd that he would turn to Palestinian psychologists and ask them for their professional view of the motivation, of the thinking, the training behind Israeli soldiers who shoot Palestinian children in front of their parents. What evidence does he have of this charge? But he just takes this as an accepted wisdom and puts it before the Palestinians who probably as surprised as I was hearing this. By the way, this is completely consistent with his attitude towards IDF operations in other theaters. Travers was a member of UNIFIL, an officer in UNIFIL, and he charges in an interview he gave with the Middle East Monitor on February 2nd of this year that during that period, the IDF took out Irish soldiers, members of UNIFIL, and deliberately shot them. There is no case of this. This is a complete lie. But it's part of a consistent view that Travers has towards the Israel Defense Forces, which really indicate what his prejudices are. By the way, it comes as no surprise that Travers praises Hamas in that same Middle East Monitor interview. He talks about their cooperation that they provided. He tries to say that the Hamas did not intimidate Palestinian witnesses, when we know from paragraph 440 of the Goldstone Report that the report specifically states that Palestinian witnesses would not speak about Palestinian armed groups because of a fear of reprisals. By who? By the Hamas government. He obviously rejects the notion in his analysis that the Hamas shielded its military forces with a civilian population. And obviously he does not accept that Israel faced a problem of what we call asymmetric warfare. It's just interesting to look here at the reality of what existed in the Gaza Strip, because you see exactly that the military capabilities of Hamas were placed right in the heart of the civilian population. And that Israel basically had three choices of what it could do. It could simply accept the continued rocket fire which emanated from the Gaza Strip for 8 years and say there's nothing we can do. The rocket fire comes from areas that are heavily populated. It could adopt brutal Russian tactics that might have been used in Chechnya. That was not something Israel would never do, and just attack the civilian population directly. Or it could try and separate the civilian population from the military capabilities of Hamas, which is exactly the strategy that Israel followed. And is exactly the challenge that every country facing this kind of a situation, where military and civilian capabilities and presence are mixed, that's the kind of strategy any country would have to follow. That is called the challenge of asymmetric warfare. But he, in his report, rejects that. He, in fact, rejects the term that's used by Israeli and American military analysts. Let me move on further with Colonel Travers. Colonel Travers puts forward a thesis that, I just don't know where to exactly place this. I don't know if it's Tom Clancy or the worst speech I ever heard in the UN in my life. But what he basically states is that Israel used unmanned aerial vehicles during Operation Cast Lead that had infrared or thermal capabilities to see into buildings so you could see how many people were inside. So, for example, he suggests in his analysis, and this is again from the Middle East Monitor of February 2010, that Israel would look into the heart of Palestinian buildings in the Gaza Strip, especially when families would concentrate themselves inside these various houses, and then, on the basis of there being a sort of sufficient concentration of population in Palestinian houses, Israel would launch missile attacks against those specific houses. Obviously, this is consistent with the view of the whole Goldstone Commission, which talks about deliberate attacks against civilians. But it's even more evil because it suggests that we just didn't waste our munitions on houses that had a few civilians in them, but look for the houses which had large concentrations of civilians. There's one technical flaw in his analysis. Israel does not have unmanned aerial vehicles with this capability. So where does he get this assertion? How does he reach such a conclusion? Moreover, morally, it's completely inconsistent with the kind of warfare that Israel tried to wage. As I said before, Israel was trying to separate the military capabilities of Hamas from the civilian population through the multiple warning systems. But that doesn't affect his analysis. He takes the most dire, serious, and vicious interpretation of Israeli intentions possible. Another very important element of how Desmond Travers operates is also in how he presents data. For example, he tries to state that Israel was not justified in going into Gaza with Operation Cast Lead. And when he tries to make this assertion, he says, well, there were only 2 rocket attacks in the month prior to the war. Remember when the war begins, December 27th, 2008. Go back a month, November 27th, 2008. Were there only 2 rockets historically fired against Israel in that time period? Well, I can tell you that if I just take 3 days in December, December 16th, 17th, and 18th, prior to the war, we have 32 Hamas rockets fired at Israel. So how does he get 2 rockets fired? His use of data and information is seriously flawed and completely inconsistent with anybody who followed what was going on in the outbreak of the war. By the way, he also says that Hamas wanted to continue the Tahadiyah, the lull agreement that existed. Well, we know for certain from multiple sources that Hamas unilaterally broke the Tahadiyah, from Khalid Mashal in Damascus, and from the spokesman for the Izzadin al-Qassam units. So there's a fundamental problem with how Travers, who is supposed to be a military man, deals with historical data and military data that, in connection with the war. I want to focus last about an issue that keeps coming up in Travers' analysis, and that is it really deals with the professionalism of his investigations. One of the big controversies that is generated by the Goldstone Report is the question of whether mosques in the Gaza Strip were militarized. Now, one of the unfortunate developments that has occurred across the Middle East is exactly this problem, the militarization of mosques. In Fallujah, in 2004, during the Iraq War, 60 mosques were identified by the U.S. Army as either containing insurgents or their weaponry. 60 mosques. Now, Israel knew about military materiel in various Palestinian mosques in the Gaza Strip. And in fact, we have documented that military presence in previous appearances that I've made and certainly other Israelis have made. Let me, before I turn to this, make the point that Travers states in an interview he gave with Harper's Magazine on October 29, 2009. He makes a sweeping generalization. He says, we found no evidence that mosques were used to store munitions. Now, how does he deal with those in Israel who say, yes, munitions were stored in those mosques? Then he says in response, well, those charges reflect Western perceptions in some quarters that Islam is a violent religion. In other words, his analysis, military analysis, of whether mosques were used or not isn't based on any kind of hard evidence, isn't based on investigating the mosques themselves, but rather on his view that anybody who would even think that a mosque had been militarized simply has some kind of a prejudice against Islam as a religion. The fact of the matter is, this statement that mosques were not used to store munitions is completely wrong. And I'll just show you a couple of very small examples. If we could move the cursor first to the upper left-hand case and click there. This is the Al-Zaytun Mosque with rockets inside with an 05 anti-aircraft gun. And this is just one case of one mosque. Now, of course, he doesn't even accept that this is possible. How does he deal with just very clear pictures of the Zaytun Mosque? Well, what he says in his last interview, Travers asserts that Israel made up these pictures. They're false. They're fake. Israel produced fake evidence. But remember his principle, that in the Islamic world, mosques are not used for military purposes. And anyone who says it is against Islam. I just want to show you in the lower right-hand corner a case. We'll click that. This is the Ibn Taymiyyah Mosque in Rafiq, which had been taken over by an Al-Qaeda affiliate who was fighting Hamas. In other words, his fundamental notion that it's impossible that mosques can be used for military purposes is also contradicted by what happened on August 14th, 2009, when there was a clash between Hamas and an Al-Qaeda affiliate in the city of Rafiq. Of course, we would offer no explanation of how this is possible. The other two cases I won't go into, they just show that, in fact, mosques had been used to store munitions, either through secondary explosives in the upper right-hand corner, or mosques were used as an area from which rockets were launched. Maybe you could show this picture in the lower left-hand corner. And there you see the minaret of the mosque from where the rocket was launched, Qassam rocket at Israel. In other words, we have overwhelming evidence of this. Now, the final point is his notion that mosques weren't used to store munitions was actually contradicted by a former British officer by the name of Tim Collins, who went to the Gaza Strip for the BBC. And we've taken a segment out of his appearance on Newsnight, which appeared on the 20th of January 2010. And what is interesting here is that Collins inspects a mosque that Israel attacked. And he goes down into the basement of the mosque to understand what was the source of the damage, because there was more damage there than just the Israeli strike. And what he finds is that there were secondary explosives that were caused by the fact that munitions were stored in the basement of the mosque. In other words, Tim Collins, on the site inspection, a former British officer who served in Iraq, completely contradicts the statements of Travers, which were not made by inspecting a mosque. In fact, Travers says, I saw 2 mosques in the whole Gaza Strip. Just hear what Collins has to say with an on-site inspection on a mosque in Gaza.
In Iraq, this mosque was hit by an Israeli airstrike in the early days of the war last December. I wanted to see for myself why it was targeted. Whenever it came in here, it penetrated straight through the roof, bringing daylight in here, and it's absolutely destroyed the place. The allegation was that this was used as a storage facility for weapons. I have to say, what was commonplace in Iraq also seemed to be evident in Gaza as well. Down in the cellar of the mosque, there was clear evidence of secondary explosions. It's my opinion that the only thing that could have caused this was if explosives had been stored here. In my view, that's the only logical explanation. This is the scene of one of the most tragic incidents.
Okay. That's a professional military analysis. Not simply asserting anybody who says that weapons were stored in mosques is anti-Islamic. That was the basis on which, obviously, Travers worked. Now, I think one of the problems with the professionalism of Travers, and we're reaching a conclusion here, is that Travers does not ask hard questions. Remember, he is the military man on the Goldstone mission. When Palestinian witnesses came in July to meet with the Goldstone mission and meet with all 4 members, he was the man who was supposed to ask the military-related questions. The others were international lawyers or judges. So one would expect from him the kind of military questions that the intelligence analyst, that a man from the planning branch would ask. For example, did he ask witnesses who spoke about a house being destroyed whether they were members of the Izzudin al-Qassam units? No. He didn't even ask the question. Did he ask them whether there were Grad rockets stored in their basement, like in the case of many of these mosques? He didn't ask the question. Now, how do I know, and how does Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Levy know they didn't ask those questions? Because those interviews with the Palestinians in Gaza, like the first clip you saw, were put on the website of the United Nations. So if you have the time and you want to spend a few hours reviewing all the testimony of Palestinian witnesses, you can do it. And you'll find questions like, how do you explain how Israeli soldiers shot at Palestinian children? But you won't find the kind of professional military questions that a good military analyst will ask. And that, I think, for us, leads us to the conclusion that Travers was not as serious and was not a professional analyst of the developments that occurred in Operation Cast Lead. And that raises serious questions about the reliability of the whole military analysis in that report. Let me add something which I did not want to make the central subject of today, but nonetheless hovers over everything he is saying, especially his very harsh accusations against the state of Israel and against the morality of Israeli soldiers. At one point, he is confronted with the fact that the British didn't go along with many of the conclusions of the report. They abstained in various UN fora. British military men like Tim Collins, like Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, had serious doubts about the Goldstone Report. And so all of a sudden, Travers makes the following statement. Britain's foreign policy interests in the Middle East seem to be influenced strongly by Jewish lobbyists. That's a quote. Now, unless Travers himself corrects this statement that he made, it's as plain as day that it has anti-Semitic overtone. And it raises questions about his own motivation and his own reliability as an analyst on anything in the Middle East. I would say he cannot be an analyst on any military issue and should not be employed by the United Nations. But what I would expect is that given his statement and given his other statements that fly in the face of the facts of the Gaza war, of Operation Cast Lead, I would expect that Justice Richard Goldstone should repudiate Colonel Travers and completely reject the conclusions he reached as a result of Travers' work. Thank you. I turn the floor over to Lieutenant Colonel. Sure, you have a couple of questions. Go ahead.
Do you think that it was a mistake for Israel not to cooperate with the Goldstone Commission rather than have to, scramble to present Israel's case after the fact?
Let me tell you the problem. I understand the temptation to say, well, had Israel cooperated, the report would have come out differently. There are a number of Israelis who were willing to provide materials to the Goldstone mission. There's a Colonel Daniel Reisner, who actually, formerly of the Israeli
Military Advocate General.
Thank you very much. Military Advocate General's office. And Colonel Reisner actually flew to Geneva and made an appearance before the Goldstone mission. And what he found is while there was plenty of Palestinian testimony on their website, his testimony was ignored. He felt it wasn't dealt with. And he himself, because he actually testified there, said, you know what? If Israel cooperated with the Goldstone mission, it wouldn't have improved anything. And now I'm adding, from the material that I've seen with Travers, this looked like a kangaroo court. And I don't think anything Israel would have done would have improved the results. And let me bring it home, and I'll ask also Yoni to expand on this. How did Goldstone reach the conclusion, and how did the mission reach the conclusion, that Israel deliberately killed civilians? When I was at Brandeis debating Goldstone, he specifically went into this. He said, I wanted to find very clear instances where there was no fog of war, in which Palestinians were killed by IDF fire, but there were no military operations in the area. And so he said he found 11 instances like this. What's his source of information? There was no Palestinian fire and the IDF was firing. Palestinian testimony. But as I told you earlier, in paragraph 440 of the report, he says the Palestinian witnesses were afraid to speak about Palestinian military operations. So how can you say in one part of the report the Palestinians were afraid, the witnesses were afraid to talk about Palestinian military operations, in another part of the report you say because there were no military operations in the area, Israel was deliberately killing civilians. It's a fundamental contradiction. Now this is where our work here at the Jerusalem Center comes in. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Dore Halevi had been researching the Gaza war on the websites of Hamas, Islamic Jihad. And what he found was that, in fact, Hamas and the Islamic Jihad took credit for Palestinian military operations against the IDF precisely in the area where Palestinian witnesses in Gaza were too afraid to relate to those particular instances. Now, could Colonel Travers and the military analysts of Goldstone go out into the same websites as Lieutenant Colonel Halevi? Certainly. Open source material. It's relatively easy to do. You don't have to have a big intelligence agency working for you. Just go to the open source material in Arabic. Well, now I'm going to share with you inside information. Lieutenant Colonel Halevi sent me 60 pages in Arabic of what's called the Hamas War Diary, which had this information. It also had information, that and other materials. Pardon?
How did you find it, the diary?
He'll give you the URL. It's on the web, in Arabic. And I'm going to share with you something else.
Why someone will put it on the web?
You mean what if it's made up? I'll ask him to answer. Will you answer that question? Why don't you answer it right now?
Hamas documents.
Wait, come up here, Yoni.
Hamas documents on a daily basis all of these operations. So if you gather all this information, all the announcements, you get the whole diary of Hamas.
Okay. So it's all formal documents, right?
Formal Hamas documents. They not only say that there were military operations, like in Zaytun neighborhood, where some of the most horrible instances in the Goldstone Report are located. They not only talk about those operations, they also say, for example, that Hamas had a military modus operandi, that if Hamas was looking at a civilian house, and they assumed that there were Israeli soldiers in that house, and they knew there were Palestinian civilians in the house, they shot at that house in the Gaza Strip. What does that suggest about who's responsible for losses in these terrible cases where civilians might have been hurt, in fact were hurt?
Okay, so can I ask
So let me just give you the final closure on this. I sent Lieutenant Colonel Yoni Dore Halevi's material to the Goldstone Commission before it was ever released. And then I called them and I said, I'm sending you 60 pages in Arabic. Do you want us to translate it for you? And I was told, no, we have people who can read this. I'll let Lieutenant Colonel Halevi describe how the Goldstone Report related to our material. But it goes back to your question. Here was material that could have had a very strong impact on the way the fundamental issues that are analyzed by the report appear. They might have raised questions. Well, maybe it's not so certain that there was no fog of war. Maybe there was a fog of war. Maybe Israel was engaged in very hard battles in Zaytun neighborhood, and I can't say that Israel was killing civilians deliberately. But that means they would have to take our material seriously. Well, we barely made it into the footnote, whereas others made it into the central analysis. Please, Anji.
You're saying that you're basically attacking the whole basis for the Goldstone Report, at least military analysis. Would you not say that Israel should now set up a commission to investigate the report and what actually happened there, which the government is still refusing to do right now?
there's a decision the Israeli government has to make about how to handle this situation. I know that there was an initial report given to the Secretary General, which is, I think, available on the web at the Foreign Ministry website, that analyzes maybe 4 or 5 incidents that were controversial in the Goldstone Report. And we are expecting a complete report on the instances raised by Goldstone in the weeks and months ahead. But it's clear that Israel can address the charges made in the Goldstone Report. And it is looking at the facts.
In what form, asking you as a former advisor to the Prime Minister, in what form do you think they should be doing this? Because you're doing a press conference at a think tank, which is very important. It's not the same thing as the government not only publishing a report, sorry, but having a serious investigation, public and transparent.
Because I'm a private think tank, I obviously am not going to start analyzing incidents from the war from the standpoint of what happened on the ground. But I certainly have a right to analyze the faulty methodology used by trappers and raise serious questions.
Do you think the Israeli government should now set up a commission?
I think it is. I think it would be reasonable, certainly, for different branches of the IDF to take the material that it is currently developing and bring it to some kind of conclusion about the veracity of the Goldstone Report. I mean, for example, Mohammed Fuad Abu Askar, whose house is described in the report as the destruction of whose house is described in the report as a case of indiscriminate IDF fire against civilians, against civilian infrastructure. Well, in the last presentation to the Secretary General, the IDF reveals that in Abu Askar's home, there were Grad rockets in the basement, and therefore it was a legitimate military target. To say that it was just a civilian target that Israel deliberately destroyed is completely misleading. So I think it would be useful if we take all of the reports on the instances that Goldstone raises and bring them together.
And that's different from an independent commission.
Look, let me say something, because I know, at least in this area, I know there are many people abroad who are saying, well, why don't you get a former justice of the Supreme Court to form a commission of inquiry? You know what? I rely on Dore. Why do I say that? Because in the Israeli military system, as all of you know, we have the Judge Advocate General, the Patsar. He can independently order investigation even if a divisional commander doesn't want it, which is not true in other Western armies. And let's say he doesn't do his work. Well, then the legal advisor, the Attorney General, can order an investigation of any military case that comes on his desk. And let's say the legal advisor doesn't do his work, doesn't want to. No naim lo. Then the Supreme Court can order an investigation. In June of 2009, when a Spanish court, still operating under the laws of universal jurisdiction in Spain, which had not yet been altered, considered the Israeli legal system and whether it was fitting for the Spanish legal system to order an investigation of the killing of Shchada by the IDF and the civilians who were killed as a result. The Spanish court decided that the Israeli legal system was sufficiently competent to handle it itself, and therefore, by the principle of complementarity, it wasn't going to initiate an investigation using universal jurisdiction in Spain because Israel's investigation was inadequate. In other words, the Spanish decided that Israel's investigative system was fine. So what I'm saying is that why do we need to have, in my opinion, a special investigation of the war when we have civilian oversight in the state of Israel to an extent that no other army has? And why should we start getting other retired Supreme Court justices involved when if the Supreme Court of the State of Israel finds it fitting, it can investigate it itself? So that's the structure of the Israeli legal system. And so I think to talk about my personal opinion, to talk about an additional investigation of Operation Cast Lead at this point would be completely redundant.
But he could put the fallout. He could control the negative fallout in terms of the creative.
In my opinion, we cannot, Israel is now waging two kinds of wars. There is the military struggle against terrorism, like many countries in the world, and there's a political war being waged against the state of Israel. And the political war being waged by Hamas through its legal arm, through courts in London, is seeking to tie the hands of the IDF so that Israeli army can no longer defend the state of Israel. And I think it would be a terrible mistake for us to fall into the trap that Hamas is setting for us in that respect. And therefore, if in the future we are forced into conflict against our will, and we have to defend the state of Israel, I would not like to see Israeli generals going into battle with lawyers at their side carrying briefcases.